Bureau of Intelligence and Research and concurrently served as Senior Policy Advisor to the US Special Ambassador. So we have a wealth of knowledge with us today to help us address these issues. And I should note that this project has been made possible through generous support by the Korea Foundation and Luce Foundation. And we truly appreciate their sponsorship of this important topic. And we really look forward to tonight's discussion. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Rachel to kick us off.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you and the 38 North team for hosting this roundtable and giving me and Bob a chance to talk about our research. I wanted to start out with a brief background of the project, the significance of the research and the methodology and scope of the research, and then move on to providing an overview of the two topics that we tracked, the civilian versus defense spending discussion and Kim Jong-un's reform initiatives. And then close off with my three key takeaways before turning it over to Bob. So with that, I'll start with the significance of the economic policy question. Jenny touched upon this a little bit in her introduction, but what drove this project were the deeper and broader questions of resource allocation priorities and the balance between central control and latitude and lower level units. These two issues have implications for North Korea's domestic and foreign policy and signals the extent to which Kim Jong-un will carry out economic reform. How the North Korean economic discourse evolves is critical as the country continues to experiment with new ideas and practices to improve its economic management methods, which is a code word for the country's reform initiatives. The economy will always be a central component in any question relating to North Korea, whether it's denuclearization, inter-Korean relations, US-North Korea relations, and even unification. And it will be impossible to successfully implement economic initiatives without that could support denuclearization or promote inter-Korean reconciliation without a full understanding of North Korea's current and future economic policy calculus. New ideas and economic concepts cannot be simply imposed from the outside. They will have to be formulated, introduced, and implemented in a way that builds on what is already there, either in terms of practice or ideas that have already been discussed. And in terms of the methodology and scope, this project focused on the timing and sequencing of initiatives introduced and rolled out under Kim Jong-un, specifically what types of discussions took place and the type of opposition they may have encountered, if any. To do this, we reviewed North Korea's top two economic journals, Kyungjae-Yongu and the Kim Il-sung University Journal on Economics, in order to understand the types of ideas which the regime allows for discussion and the range of policy choices it appears to have seriously examined over the years. Kim Jong-un assumed power in late 2011, as we all know, but our study reached back to 2007. And one reason for going back that far was to avoid the pitfall that arguments appearing after Kim Jong-un took power were new to his leadership. We also wanted to examine how North Korea's economic policy in the last few years of Kim Jong-il's reign may have shaped his son's economic policies. And out of a range of topics addressed in these two economic journals, we keyed in on the themes that appeared to best represent the leadership's thinking on reform and competing priorities. And these included socialist principles and economic management, economic systems, prioritization of industries and resource allocation, banking, and revisionism. And some of these themes appeared to reveal tensions between the traditional views of socialist principles and the more flexible reformist interpretations, the challenges facing the regime as it pushes its reform agenda, and the extent to which the regime appears willing to implement its economic reform initiatives. And as I noted, one of the primary sources we used for this research is Kyungjae-Yongu, and it's a quarterly economic journal published in North Korea. And experts who follow Pyongyang's economic policies unanimously agree that this journal is the single most important North Korean source of information on the economy, because the journal offers insight on the regime's current policies and the direction in which it is headed, with a level of detail that is not available in North Korea's central media like Rodong Shinmun and Minju Chosan and radio and television. In fact, Kyungjae-younggu's the journal functions as an economic policy handbook that discusses and to some extent reflects different views on aspects of still unofficial party policies, and even guidelines not published in central media, but issued by Kim Jong-un in his private talk with officials, or circulated in the form of internal party instructions. This magazine, unfortunately, ceased to be published as of the end of 2020, probably because it didn't meet the standards of an academic journal. All of the articles appearing in Kyungjae-younggu are more like essays. So starting in 2019, the Kim Il-sung University Journal on Economics started publishing articles that became much longer and more structured, looking more like academic papers instead of essays. And I will now recap some of the findings from our research, starting with the civilian versus defense spending discussion. So there has long been a tug of war in the North Korean leadership over military versus civilian spending. The question of whether North Korea is allocating more resources to defense than to the civilian economy goes beyond whether North Korea is planning to build and test more missiles. This issue is important because the more funds the regime allocates to national defense, the less resources that can be spent to prop up and revitalize the civilian economy, which would leave little room for reform-oriented ideas and measures to take root. In recent years, proponents of defense spending were forced to demonstrate how money in the defense sector is actually good for the economy, supports other non-defense sectors, and at the end of the day, stimulates growth overall. And the opponents argued that defense spending was money wasted and actually undermined civilian economic growth. The quantity of journal articles dealing primarily with or were exclusively dedicated to the defense industry decreased sharply, starting with the first volume of 2011, and that was shortly before Kim Jong-un made his public debut in September 2010. And this seemed to give more weight to more articles on economic management, which is associated with reform, to be published in the economic journals. I want to now talk about economic management and how that was dealt with in the economic journals. The starting point for North Korea's reform was Kim Jong-un's report at a party plenum in March 2013, where he defined the broad principles of his economic reform for the first time. He referred to his reform package as economic management methods of our style, and defined them as enabling enterprises to carry out their business activities independently and creatively under the state's unified guidance, and workers to fulfill their roles and responsibilities within the socialist economic system. This one single passage on economic management was a result of more than a year of research on reform, doing test runs at some economic sites, and rolling out successful initiatives nationally. And it set the stage of rolling out reform by sector in phases, starting with agriculture, then enterprises, and finally the banking sector. 11 months after Kim Jong-un's plenum report, in February 2014, Kim Jong-un gave his first public endorsement of the plot responsibility. Sometimes it's known as the field responsibility system, which is agricultural reform, and it's that endorses smaller scale incentivized farming. So 3 months after Kim Jong-un's endorsement of agricultural reform, in May 2014, Kim had a talk with senior party, state, and army officials and formalized what he mentioned before, the economic management methods of our style. And it came in three pillars: the state's unified guidance of the economy. That was the first. And then the second point was correct implementation of the socialist enterprise responsibility management system. And since that's very long, I'm just going to refer to that as SERMS from here on out. So correct implementation of SERMS within the parameters of the socialist economy. And then lastly, and the third point, the party's leadership over economic work. And SERMS is basically giving individual enterprises greater independence in planning, production, and management of resources and profits. And SERMS made up the main part of the economic management methods that Kim Jong-un formalized in his talk in May 24. But it should be noted that here, the state's unified guidance and the party's leadership were always in the backdrop of Kim's reform initiatives, and that North Korea never meant to give full independence to individual units. So accordingly, it is not surprising to find references to the state's unified guidance or the party's leadership in any journal article about economic management, including articles endorsing reform. So the appearances of these formulations, like the state's unified guidance and party leadership alone, do not signal North Korea's hardening economic line or North Korea rolling back on reform. Since Kim Jong-un introduced economic management methods in 2013, North Korean journals have introduced various concepts related to reform. And the single recurring and central question appearing in these journal articles is central control versus lower units independence. And more specifically, it's about exactly how much responsibility central institutions, namely the state and the party, should give to individual units. And while the key principles and concepts associated with economic management do not appear to have evolved over time, different articles and authors have taken different positions on or emphasized different aspects of the central question. So for example, some authors have stressed lower units management rights and de-emphasized the cabinet's management responsibility, while other articles have opted to do just the opposite, where they would emphasize the state's or even the party's role in managing or guiding the economy, and de-emphasizing lower units management rights. So sometimes two different authors writing for the same volume of the same journal would take slightly opposing views on the dynamic of state and lower units responsibility. So I mentioned that Kim Jong-un rolled out his reform in phases, starting with agriculture and then the enterprises, and then finally banking. So banking reform came last. Presumably because, number one, banks are meant to support enterprises' business activities, and it made sense to make headway with SERMS first on the enterprise side. And secondly, commercial banking was an unfamiliar territory to North Korea, and it needed more time to figure out how to adapt banking to North Korea's needs. And third, banking was a sensitive issue in North Korea. North Korean journals published articles introducing foreign banking practices in the first few years of Kim Jong-un's rule, signaling that research was underway about internal financial and banking reform. And in a letter to a national meeting of financial and banking officials in December 2015, Kim gave instructions on the role of banks in support of SERMS, currency circulation and stability, and instituting the accounting system of financial institutions, which is the equivalent of SERMS in the banking sector, that gave greater latitude to individual banks on how they operated their respective units. In fact, the major purpose of the banking reforms appears to have been to support SERMS from all angles, making banks profitable so that they could provide more loans and to keep money in circulation and support enterprises' business activities. At the center of the banking sector overhaul was the issue of expanding the role of commercial banks. defining how these banks differed from the central bank and how much creativity commercial banks were to exercise apart from central control and instructions. Commercial banks had long been portrayed as symbols of capitalism, and trying to sell these banks as being crucial for the North Korean economy must have required some calibrated approach by Pyongyang. Whether North Korea was not ready to promote banking so quickly, or whether it had to do with sensitivities, there was a curious gap of nearly 1 year in which the journals did not pick up on the ideas set forth in Kim Jong-un's letter at the end of 2015. And when they did start picking up on the instructions given in Kim Jong-un's letter, they went beyond introducing the outside world's banking policies and sought to adapt commercial banks to North Korea's needs. North Korean journals intensified their attention to commercial banks starting in 2018. So that was more than 2 years after Kim's letter to banking officials. And more notably, that was when in 2018, that was when Kim was shifting to direct diplomatic engagement with Seoul and Washington. The articles focused on explaining the function of commercial banks and described ways to improve their operation. The intensified campaign may have been a response to some type of pushback from within, or perhaps the regime, which was on a path toward diplomacy and possibly an external environment that was more conducive to reform, saw it as a good opportunity to promote banking reform. So my key 3 takeaways from this research project is, well, I have 3 key takeaways. First, a close reading of journal articles shows that there is a pattern for rolling out new economic policies. So nothing seems to be instantaneous or ad hoc. First, we see signs of North Korea's interest in journals on an issue, on a specific issue, meaning Kim has issued some broad policy guidance that prompted research on that issue. Then after research is done, new ideas have been tested in some units and viable ideas have been identified. A policy is then issued and by Kim Jong-un, and the journals would go beyond simply introducing those concepts and start emphasizing why North Korea needs to implement X, Y, and Z and how they can best be operationalized. Secondly, contrary to the commonly accepted notion that there can be no dissent or inconsistencies in North Korean publications, North Korea's 2 primary economic journals, so Kyungjae-Younggu and the Kim Il-sung University Journal, they've served as a platform for voicing different opinions and views on any given issue. We saw this with defense spending and issues related to reform. And these are sensitive issues, so it's inconceivable that dueling narratives and such sensitive topics could be conducted without the concurrence and more likely the backing of various elements in the leadership. And contending views seem to surface when a policy is still under discussion within the leadership or when there is opposition to certain policies. My third and last takeaway is that the central and fundamental question of economic management or reform is finding the right balance between central control and individual units' independence. We continue to see dueling narratives on this issue, which indicates that Pyongyang is still trying to find the right answer. And since the 8th Party Congress, the general assessment among North Korea watchers seems to be that Pyongyang is slowing down on or even backtracking on reform because of the emphasis on the state's unified guidance, the party's leadership, and also because of North Korea's stated intent to continue to develop weapons. North Korea has shifted more to the side of stronger state and party control over the economy in the last year or so, but for now, this seems aimed at continuing with its reform initiatives in a more controlled environment rather than rolling back on reform. And this is because North Korea continues to promote SERMs and the plot responsibility system at high levels, such as in cabinet meetings, SPA meetings, And the premier in his guidance visits mentions those formulations. And in fact, North Korea still seems to be in stages of researching, improving, and perfecting ideas related to economic reform.
Great, thanks, Rachel. There's a lot to unpack there, and you've given us a lot to think about. And I do want the audience to feel free to pose questions in the Q&A box at any time. We will get to them. And I want to note also in the chat, you've seen that 3 of the papers in this research series have been published on 38 North. An intro that introduces the research as a whole, talks about methodology, and then one paper on defense versus civilian spending, and one on banking. And there are 2 more papers in this series that are forthcoming in the coming weeks. Before we get to questions though, Bob, I want to turn to you and see what your key takeaways are as well.
Very good, thank you, Jenny. That, I have to say, Min-Young, that was a fantastic overview. Really covered every single point, which I'm grateful for because it means I don't have to do as much. This was a very enjoyable project to work on. It was over a long period of time. There was a lot of work. And to be fair, I would have to say Min-Young did most of it. It would not have been possible without her. So she deserves full credit in that regard for sure. But when I was in the government, I was always worried that we weren't spending enough time or attention looking at behind the numbers or the cursory stories of the North Korean economy. And so this project is just one small effort meant to fit into a larger effort that I'm pretty sure is going on elsewhere by a lot of other people, including, I'm pretty sure, by a lot of people who are listening in this afternoon or this evening. Min-Young went over the methodology very well. I would only add that we were not examining only broad historical developments, but very fine details. We were looking at the zigging and zagging of informed and purposeful comment within North Korea. This is not propaganda. These are internal discussions and gives you a window into, as Min-Young said, what was approved, where the lines were, and who was actually pushing the edges of the envelope. A few takeaways of my own. I think that by looking at the journals and following the methodology as we did, we got a really good sense of how lively the discussion is in North Korea. It's much broader. As Min-Young said, it's much broader and more illuminating than what appears in the central media that we normally look at, KCNA and the party newspaper, the government newspaper. You get a much better sense of the policy process itself, of the chronology of the research, of the testing, and of the development before the implementation. And in following this, you get to see and understand better the decision points, which are crucially important to understand if you want to then trace the evolution of ideas and policies. Min-Young pointed out that there was a sequence, for example, in introducing the reforms, agriculture first, and enterprises, and then banking. And I think she had some good hypothesis on why it was in this order, but it's still a question. Why was it in this order? Was that purposeful? Was that strategic? Was it sensitivities over banking? It's something that I think we could probably spend another year looking at more closely, because it would be very illuminating and give us a sense of the persistence and the difficulties in Kim's efforts to implement his new policies. The sense of persistence, it seems to me, is overwhelming. These are not just flash in the pan ideas Kim has, and then he changes his mind. As Min Young pointed out, and this is crucial, in the March 2013 plenum, which is almost entirely, at least in the West, seen as the big shift away from economic to military, that Kim went back to Byungjin, the two-line policy. In fact, if it's read carefully and if you trace it out, it really fits in with Kim's long-term commitment to reform ideas in the economy. I'm using the word reform carefully. I know it can be a lot of debate about that. But these are new ideas, and they are certainly not orthodox in the North Korean setting. We saw something of the outlines of the connections between foreign and economic policy. That more and more, that's something that certainly they have trouble in Washington understanding and factoring in to their sense of North Korea. And I think it would be wise and useful if there's a lot more research on this. I hope many of you will use this study we did, these 3 papers, as the basis of something even more extensive. And Jenny, why don't I leave it there and leave some room for questions? Okay.
Great. Thanks, Bob. And to that point, these journals are obviously, these North Korean journals right now are only in Korean language. And so part of our research project has also been, Min Young has spent countless hours translating articles in these journals. And we have been publishing the source materials as well, in order to help try and broaden the audience that has access to the actual North Korean articles. And so for the first 2 pieces, the articles are, the associated articles are also available. And the others will be as well, again, in the coming weeks and months. It does take some time to do. So I would like to start with a couple of questions about methodology, since we are dealing with North Korean economic journals and not North Korean media. And I wonder for our audience if you could talk a little bit more about what is known or believed about who the authors of these journals are. Do we have any sense of that? Do you see repeat authors over time? And also sort of what is the level of sophistication in the discussion that they have? And do you see learning over time with those, within especially those repeat authors? So several questions all at once. Rachel, maybe I can turn to you first.
Unfortunately, there is not much known about the authors. There are certainly some recurring authors. Some were prolific writers in Kim Jong-il's era, and then I think they were phased out, or they graduated, they retired, and then we did see a new generation of writers coming on board, and this was both for Kyungjae-Yeongu and Hakbo, which is the Kim Il-sung University Journal. Sometimes you'll see some authors writing for both of those journals, and some writers write for one or the other. I think the ones that write for the Kim Il-sung University Journal are Kim Il-sung University staff, but that's only my assumption. When you look at the bylines, they don't really give you the affiliations of these people. They are actually just names. Sometimes their titles would be given, like associate professor, but that's about it. They don't really tell you anything else. I have to assume that many of the authors who write for Gyeongju are researchers at the Academy of Social Sciences and perhaps faculty members in economic universities and colleges, departments across the country. I have heard that the researchers in the Academy of Social Sciences have sort of been on the leading edge of these discussions on reform in Kim Jong-un's time, that they were given a little more leeway in terms of research, that they were actually empowered to take the lead in research on some of the initiatives that Kim Jong-un had in mind. So I'm afraid, I guess that's my long-winded way of saying we don't know much about the affiliation of these authors, but I do want to touch on something that I mentioned briefly earlier, which is that we do see some writers who write prolifically for Gyeongju, and many of them have themes that they do write on. So some of them, like Lee Young-nam, for example, or Jong, they would write on the broader, maybe ideological issues about economic policy. Other people would specialize on specific issues, maybe like green economy, for example, green growth, or the environment and the economy. Some people would focus on, revisionism, for example, or economic structures. And we also took a look at whether some authors had streaks, like, whether they were conservative, whether they were a little more progressive. I think I see maybe two authors who tend to be conservative, but there is not enough consistency for me to come out and state that they are conservative. I think that they tend to be, but there is not much consistency. Also, there are authors who would write on a single theme, but take different positions. So this author Jong, who writes on the broader ideological issues related to the economy and economic issues. 1 year, this person took a very strong stand about giving more autonomy to lower level units. And then 2 years later, the same author wrote an article that was all about strengthening the cabinet's management of lower level units and, giving them more detailed guidance and getting more involved, which was quite different from the position that the same author took a few years back. I don't know if Bob had anything more to add to that.
So then the flip side of that question then is, this isn't the party's daily, it's not for necessarily the average person's consumption. So who do we believe the audience for this is? And as Mark Tokla has also asked, if they are the articles written as if they were from experts for experts, or are they trying to popularize their idea for non-experts?
I think it's mostly the former. I think these are from experts to experts. I do have to wonder who has access to these journals. I'm told that not many people even have access to Norodong Shinmun. So I do have to wonder how many people actually have, number one, access to these journals, and who would actually take the time to read them and understand them. So I think it's really mostly about experts, trying to propagate ideas to fellow experts or people in the cabinet, people who work in the economic sector. That's my view.
Jenny?
Yeah.
I might add to that. When we say experts writing for experts, we're not talking about a US type situation where these conversations go nowhere because they're just between, talking heads. If you look at the Soviet Union and China, these are very important. This is an important level of discussion where new ideas are vetted and make their way up the chain into the party's apparatus for economic decision-making. Academics tend to have a lot more authority in these sorts of settings than we might imagine. And that's why this is such a good window, because it really does show you what is permissible to discuss and how the boundaries change. And you should assume, I think, that these are going up. And that's why we see them decisions made on the basis of some of this stuff.
Thanks for that. I wonder if I know Ken Gass had asked a question and Rachel, you had started to type out an answer, but for the rest of our audience, the question was really, in your assessment, you had talked about that there is some backtracking of some ideas sometimes. And so Ken had asked whether this backtracking was because one side of the debate won out or because of the external stresses on the system. And I wonder if you can talk about your answer to this question.
I think the key questions, particularly related to central control versus independence in individual units, they haven't been answered, and that's why we continue to see these dueling narratives. And so in that sense, I'm not sure that one side has won yet. I think North Korea, I'm sure North Korea does have a policy, and I think Kim Jong-un knows where he wants to go. And I think in the implementation stages, they are still trying to grapple with these key issues. And I don't think that these, at least in terms of implementation, these key issues, some of the key issues haven't been answered. And I think that their external environment, external stresses certainly do have, a role to play in some cases. For example, we saw dueling narratives surfacing in 2018 when North Korea was about defense spending versus civilian spending, when North Korea was heading toward diplomacy. And with the banking issue with CERM's economic, the enterprise reform, we saw, these different narratives coming up in the journals in 2018, I think, when North Korea was gearing up to engagement, to engage diplomatically. Bob, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh, you're still muted.
Okay. In 2018 is when we saw two articles back to back in Jong on revisionism. Extraordinary. One of them going in some detail about Khrushchev's revisionism and how his arguments were Stalin's policies aren't any good anymore because times have changed. Well, that concept, we have to change our policies because times have changed, is exactly what was used as a rationale by Kim Jong-un and others for the sorts of reforms that Min Young was talking about. So I don't think that was an accident. To me, it seemed pretty obvious that somebody was pushing back very hard on very dangerous ground. I wish the journal kept publishing so we'd be able to see if that guy stuck around or not, but I don't think we'll have a chance.
And there's no cross-population of authors, right? So between the two journals, there aren't journals that write for both journals? Does that happen? Or are they separate authors for each generally? Rachel.
Sorry, Jenny, I have to say I was looking at the questions in the Q&A box. Can you repeat that question?
Oh, sure. So just, going back to methodology here and understanding the journals. So, there was 2 key journals that you were looking at, and the assumption is that the authors within these 2 journals are completely separate, right? So you don't have authors that publish in both.
No, they do. Some of them straddle.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think the ones that do straddle, so the ones that write for Kyungjae-yongu and Hakbo are actually Kim Il-sung University staff. Because I think the ones who write for the Kim Il-sung University journals are Kim Il-sung University staff. That's my assumption.
And the Kim Il-sung University journal tends to be more generally accepted as a more academic journal than
since 2019. Since 2019, yes. So the journal has completely undergone a huge transformation. So before 2019, all of the Kim Il-sung University journal articles read like essays. So they were like Kyungjae-yongu articles. They were maybe slightly longer than Kyungjae-yongu articles, but not really academic. But starting in 2019, this journal is published biannually, not quarterly as before. And you would have maybe 12 articles, which is a major cut down from like 30 plus articles that you would see in each edition before 2019. So longer articles, they're structured. So they have like an introduction and then they have the subheads. So looking more like academic papers. And again, my assumption is that Kyungjae-yongu is no longer published because they read more like essays rather than academic papers, and they want to maybe raise the standards of these journals, and they're just now going all in on the Kim Il-sung University Journal on economics. That's my assumption.
Sure.
Or speculation.
And so one of the questions that just came up in that explanation is really, how do you define essay versus academic? What are the different characteristics that you're looking for that would sort of separate these 2?
I think when I say academic versus essay, it's like a general sort of, I guess, how we generally see an essay and how we generally see an academic journal. So like essay for me is like you have a topic and you're just writing on it. It's kind of like a column, but maybe a little more with a little more analysis. Whereas with academic journals, you have a hypothesis and you're trying to prove what you're talking about. So, and also in terms of length, the structure, those are the factors that I was looking for. So I guess what we generally have in mind when we think about an essay and an academic paper, although I guess that's subjective.
Yeah. So more structure, more hypothesis driven.
So the Kim Il-sung University articles starting in 2019, they tend to start with a question they want to talk about, and then they go into it in a very structured kind of way, with the history and then what they're doing now and where they should go and so forth. Whereas with essays in Kyungjae-yongu articles, they start out with a quote generally. From Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, so the 3 Kims. And then they briefly mention a topic they want to talk about, and then they just talk about how, why it's legitimate, why it's significant, and then, and so forth. And much shorter too.
Do they use footnotes? Do they reference?
No, nothing is annotated. Nothing is annotated. Oh, I will say the only one citation they provide is a Kim Il-sung quote or Kim Jong-il quote. So like from selected works of Kim Jong-il volume, 20, page 300 and something. So they would do that, but nothing else. Everything else is just their assertion, which I think is one of the reasons why I call them essays. Mm-hmm. But then I guess in that sense, Kim Il-sung University journals still haven't really gotten to that point that I don't see any citations.
One day, maybe.
One day, I think they're making progress.
One of the questions is also like, if you had to explain sort of the level of sophistication, again, going back to this of, are we talking, is it clear that some of these are, actual economists or maybe professor level, or, how would you describe that? And have you seen growth over time, again, in these repeat authors?
I think they are definitely, I can't say this for everybody who publishes. I think it depends on the topic. So I think the more approachable topics, like explaining Kim Il Sung's policies, Kim Jong Il's policies, with those, it's a little bit harder to tell. But I think with the more hardcore economic issues, like like economics, like math, statistics, and there are articles that show you graphs, and they talk about theories and models, and these are like Western models, like Western economic models, and algorithms, equations. So I think they were definitely written by professor level folks. And in terms of growth, I can't say that I've seen them grow like professionally as academics, but the ones that have been writing for a very long time, so since like 2005, 2007, it seems like some of them have gotten their PhDs over time because they added that little title in 2015 or 2016 that I didn't see before. So if that's a sign of growth, maybe. But again, what we were focused on as we were researching was, whether these authors, what these authors write about, and if there are any patterns. So for example, if one person writes on specific issues, how often that person writes. And we also, again, try to look for any maybe political tendencies, if that's the right way to put it. Whether a person tends to be conservative, progressive. And it's hard to say because there's not enough consistency as far as I can tell.
Bob, did you want to add to that?
Can get off of mute. Yeah. I think the takeaway is we don't know much technically about these journals or about the authors, all of which is crucial, obviously. Who assigns the articles? How soon after they're finished and potentially reviewed can they be published? You want to be able to see the gap between, let's say, the leader instructions and when a journal article appears. How much of that has to do with internal dynamics in the editorial process? There are a lot of things that we need to know, which we'd be better off knowing. But since we don't, we have to work with what we have. And I think the analysis of the content of the articles itself is both valuable and gives us good windows of opportunity, even if we don't, to understand things, even if we don't know some of these crucial details, which would make the analysis richer, I think. So if someone can go to Seoul and ask around, I'll bet that would be a boon.
And one of the questions was, how do we access the journals? And just for your information, these obviously aren't readily, easily accessible. There are some copies in, say, Library of Congress and in South Korean, the major library there, but there's also a site called DPRK Media in which you can subscribe and get access to a number of different academic journals and news publications. We did have one question from Brad Babson about, do you have any insight in how sanctions since 2017 may have impacted policy thinking and the impact of COVID on the economy and economic management? Have we seen any sense of this in the discourse that goes on in these journals?
I think that at least since they openly acknowledge that the economic situation is bad, but despite that, reforms have gone on. But I do think it's notable that since um, maybe mid to late 2020, in the midst of COVID, North Korea's line on economic policy has shifted more towards centralization. Again, that is not to say that they're backtracking on reform. I think it still means that they want to conduct reform in a more regulated, controlled way, in a way that they can control. But I think it is notable, that shift to more centralization. And it's something to, and I think it has to do with the economic situation, the worsening economic situation, which I think part of it was definitely due to the COVID lockdown, and where this narrative goes in terms of the emphasis on central control is something we should look out for.
Bob.
Yeah, one thing that they emphasize over and over again is that you need a propitious external security environment in order for the economy to grow and in order for reforms to be implemented. Given how bad the external environment has been for the last 2-3 years, it's not at all surprising that they realize they have to tighten up. And to me, what's more surprising is that they haven't given it up entirely, that Kim Jong-un refuses to throw this overboard. I suspect he's thinking ahead to the days when things will get better, and he wants to be in position to put those in gear when that happens.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is about, what are some foreign policy implications to this learning? What have we learned that really helps us better understand, potential opportunities, or help us better understand North Korea's foreign policy decisions in general?
When you look at the year 2014, 2015, when he actually pulled the trigger and started these initiatives in agriculture, enterprise, and commercial banks, he was making major moves in foreign policy to try to engage the United States. It didn't work. He didn't get it, and he had to back off. But I think the coincidence of those two things was not an accident, and I think it was an opportunity missed, probably, to at least to explore how far he was willing to go in order to provide the environment he thought he needed to move on his economic reforms even more than he did.
So did you want to add to that?
No, I think nothing to add.
Sure. I think we have time for maybe one more question. There's still some questions about methodology and about the journals themselves. I know we don't know much about who the authors necessarily are, but how would you assess how dangerous is it for them to express their ideas in these journals? Do you really think that these are their personal ideas? And is there any way to tell sort of the risks that they take when they write them?
I'm not sure that they're personal ideas, but I think it's safe to assume that they are published because they can be published, because these articles are vetted, and they would not be published unless there is some level of backing. Like if there is something that seems to go against policy, or that seemingly seems to go against policy, even those articles, that they would have some sort of backing, and that's why they're published. So I don't think that there is any personal danger in publishing them, as far as I can tell.
Great. Well, we are out of time. As usual, we always have more questions than we do time. And so unfortunately, we didn't get to all of them, but I do want to thank you, Rachel, for getting up early this morning to join us and and for Bob for joining us in nice weather, giving up a little bit of your time to help us better understand the research. Again, 3 of the papers in this series are already online. 2 more are coming, along with the associated source articles, translated source articles for other researchers to also go through and hopefully use as a research resource. We'd love to see some of your analysis based on these translated articles as well. And so thank you everyone for joining us and sticking with us for this hour. And we hope to see you